The Maori, the original settlers of New Zealand, had a unique warrior culture. They had no problem wiping out their enemies, keeping their heads as trophies, and possibly even eating them. But what exactly made Maori warriors so terrifying to the Europeans who met them compared to other indigenous peoples? On this episode of Intrigued Mind, we'll be taking a look at the incredible Maori warriors. The Maori people moved from eastern Polynesia to New Zealand sometime between 1250 and 1300 AD. They made this move on the open ocean with just canoes, which should be your first indication that they were pretty hardcore. They developed a society that produced an intense and terrifying warrior culture. Europeans who came in contact with Maori warriors would write home about how they were the fiercest people they had ever seen. Maori warriors were heavily tattooed, and tattoos had special cultural significance to them. The most common place to get them was the face, and it functioned as a sort of permanent war paint that you could wear all the time. They did neck, arm, and body tattoos as well, but face tattoos were the most common, which certainly says something about a culture. Maori warriors would usually start getting their tattoos while they were still adolescents. There was no standard template for their face tattoos. Each warrior would get their own unique design, usually based on some sort of spiral. They were tattooed on during a special ceremony, with each line intending to show the person's strength and bravery. They weren't done with a needle gun like modern tattoos. In fact, they weren't done with a needle at all. They were actually carved into the skin using a mallet and a chisel made from bone. This would have been incredibly painful, way more painful than getting a normal tattoo, which anyone today can tell you is pretty rough. The ink was made from a mixture of ash and animal fat. These tattoos weren't smooth like modern tattoos, but left permanent grooves in the skin. Face tattoos weren't the only thing Maori did to intimidate their enemies. Their most famous tradition was a dance called the Hakka. The dance involved warriors chanting, stomping, sticking out their tongues, and bulging out their eyeballs. The dance was used to scare opponents, but it was also used as a sort of fortune-telling technique. The dance would be done before a battle, and if something went wrong with it, the elders would conclude that the battle wasn't going to go well. They would change their strategy accordingly. The dance is still used by many of New Zealand's national sports teams today, even though they're just trying to score goals instead of killing people. The go-to weapon of the Maori was the mere. A mere is a kind of short, broad-bladed weapon that's shaped like a big teardrop. Despite looking like a club, it was actually primarily used to strike or jab an opponent. They were usually made from jade and used for close-quarter fighting. Warriors would hold them in one hand and aim their jabs at the ribs, neck, or temples. A strike to the back of the head, where the skull is weakest, could also smash the opponent's head open. The mere is quite an unusual weapon. In the rest of the world, clubs were wielded like axes, and you'd swing them downward and try to hit your enemies that way. But the mere functioned more like a short sword. A skilled Maori warrior with a mere could defeat an enemy who had a longer weapon like a spear. Meres were often used in tandem with a shield. Maori war parties, called hapus, were sometimes made up of women as well as men. Europeans visiting New Zealand found these mixed fighting groups highly unusual. Warriors were trained starting from a young age. Every male was trained as a warrior. When they attacked enemy tribes, they would try to approach their camp as stealthily as possible. Sometimes, they would pretend to be on a hunting expedition so that they could travel without arousing suspicion. When they got close enough, they would attack, usually at dawn. Every man in the opposing tribe would be killed, since they didn't want to risk anyone coming back and trying to get revenge. Women would be taken home as prizes whenever possible. The Maori's other favorite spoil of war was their enemies' heads. They were known for taking home the heads of their fallen enemies. Once they were back to base, they would remove the brain and the eyes. All the orifices would then be sealed shut with flax fiber and gum. The head was then boiled or steamed in an oven and left to dry in the sun for several days. A shark oil treatment to top it all off would ensure that the head could be kept as a trophy for a long time without decomposing. If all that wasn't enough, they would also play games with the heads. They would put them into piles with the head of the rival chief on top. Then, they would throw stones or other heads at the pile and try to knock it off the top. Clearly, these were not people who knew how to celebrate a victory. James Cook's first encounter with Maori involved heads. When he reached New Zealand in 1767, the Maori, who were already weary of Europeans by then, sent out 2 war canoes. As they approached Cook's ship, they stood up and held out the shrunken heads of their latest opponents. I can only assume that some people on board wanted to just leave immediately after that warm welcome. The most famous Maori warrior was Hongihika, who had extensive contact with the Europeans that continued to come to New Zealand despite this intimidation. Hongi was a warrior and chief and became a very influential figure in the early years of European contact and settlement. He was one of the first Maori leaders to recognize the advantages of European muskets in warfare. That may seem like a pretty easy thing to realize, but guns in the late 18th century and early 19th century were inaccurate and took a long time to reload. Despite this, they were of course ultimately superior to melee weapons. The Battle of Moremanui in 1808 also made some Maori warriors think that muskets weren't going to catch on. During this pivotal battle, Hongi's tribe lost because many of their warriors were stabbed to death while reloading their muskets. Two of Hongi's brothers were killed. Hongi himself only managed to survive by escaping and hiding in a swamp. Despite this, he still saw the potential of firearms to revolutionize combat in New Zealand, and he correctly predicted that the first ones to master muskets would be unbeatable. With the correct strategy and warriors who had been properly trained in shooting, the mere would be no match for the musket. Hongihika used European muskets to take over most of the northern island of New Zealand in a series of conflicts now known as the Musket Wars. He actually wanted Europeans to settle in the area and had mutually beneficial relationships with the first missionary groups. This is why he had a steady supply of guns and ammo. Western agricultural techniques he helped introduce benefited the Maori. He was instrumental in creating a written form for the Maori language. He even traveled to England and met King George IV, who gifted him a suit of armor. He would later wear this armor in battle, terrifying his enemies. One of the darker aspects of Maori culture was infanticide. It was dark, but not unusual as far as warrior cultures go. Female infants were more likely to be killed because the tribes wanted to have as many males as possible so they could have more warriors. This would ensure the security of the tribe. Males were also more likely to get killed in battle, meaning that later on in life, the gender ratio could get balanced back out. If there was something physically wrong with the baby, infanticide was also common. It's highly debated whether or not Maori warriors participated in something that's possibly even darker: cannibalism. Some historians think that the idea of Maori being cannibals was just European propaganda. They wanted to portray Maori as being wild savages to justify their own actions. However, there are also oral histories from the tribe themselves that seem to indicate that they would eat their enemies on occasion. It's thought that there would be a few reasons for eating people in a Maori warrior context. It wasn't really that they needed the calories, it was about internalizing their spirit, or their mana. Another theory is that cannibalism was a part of the post-battle rage. Maybe they ate their enemies in a sort of frenzy, not as a part of a pre-planned ritual. It could have also been about sending a message, just like the heads. Nobody wants to go into battle imagining that they're going to get eaten if they lose. Maori had a unique way of burying the ones who didn't survive battle. They buried people twice. After a couple weeks of mourning, the body would be wrapped in mats and buried the first time and allowed to decompose. A year later, the body would be dug up. By this point, it would be mostly bones, but any remaining flesh would be scraped off. The bones would then be painted with red ochre, a natural pigment. Once painted, they were taken around to different settlements and mourned once again. One last ceremony would take place before being buried again. The second burial was the true final resting place. It's only fitting that the Maori, who lived unlike anyone else, would also die unlike anyone else. For more videos on the most amazing forgotten parts of our history, be sure to subscribe to the Intrigued Mind channel. Like the video and leave your suggestions in the comments below.